Today on Psychedelics, I sit down with Stephen Gray, an author, community organizer, and pioneer in cannabis ceremonies. For over 5 decades, Stephen has been exploring the intersections of cannabis, psychedelics, and spirituality. His wisdom on these topics is profound, making him an ideal guide for those eager to understand these powerful substances on a deeper level. Our captivating chat with Stephen journeys through a variety of fascinating topics. We discuss his latest book, How Psychedelics Can Help Save the World, and share insights into how mantras and Tibetan Buddhist meditation practices can be used to focus the mind and ground us in the present moment. Stephen shares his experience with the Tibetan Buddhist community, the Native American Church, and the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, all of which have fueled his belief in the potential of a global shift in consciousness. But the conversation doesn't stop there. We tackle the healing power of psychedelics, the role they can play in inspiring creativity and fostering a deeper connection with our planet. We even touch upon the potential for decriminalizing psychedelics. So get comfortable, open your mind, and join us for a journey that transcends the ordinary, explores the spiritual, and dreams of a future where psychedelics are embraced for their healing power. Enjoy, and see you on the other side. Stephen, welcome to Psychedelics. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Happy to be here with you and discuss this material.
Yeah, so you're the author of 3 books, including your latest book, How Psychedelics Can Help Save the World. You've been on this journey, I was reading, for 50 years of spiritual and sacred medicines. You're a community organizer, a leader in cannabis ceremonies as well. You accomplished a lot, and it's an honor to have you here on the show. And I love the book. I mean, I haven't read it fully. I started reading it, and I just love how it flows. And you've got contribution in there from like 25 amazing voices, and I can't wait to dive in. Good. So how's your day going so far? I'll start after all this.
No problem so far.
No problem so far. Good.
No demons have appeared in the corners of my mind.
That's wonderful. Yeah. What are some of those daily practices you've done today to keep you aware and awakened?
Well, nothing formal, actually. Excuse me. I don't know what to say about that exactly. I just have my normal sort of morning routine, have a bath, shave, eat breakfast, drink coffee, look at the New York Times online and a couple of other sources just to see what's going on in the so-called world, that kind of thing. And played my guitar a little bit for 15 minutes or so this morning. It's always good therapy,
There you go.
Yeah.
So you've got you do have your practice. I mean, the guitar, and you've been working with music for many years, right?
Yeah, in one way or another. I used to teach elementary school music. I was a music specialist, and I've had some sort of semi-pro, kind of more toward the amateur side of semi-pro, I suppose you could say, groups. One group in particular back in the 90s, and we played a fair number of gigs, but they were all at sort of, I don't know, the lower end of things, supposedly, I guess you could say. We played a couple of downtown clubs and we played at some smaller festivals and that sort of thing. And I made 3 albums of kind of sort of like ambient music. I don't even know what to describe it. It's busier than ambient music, but it's still kind of focused on a meditative, angle or whatever. And now I just play a little, get together with my buddy Adrian every week and play some songs. We both play guitar and sing and do some harmonies with each other and some soloing and stuff like that, and pick simple songs to work with. And we make it into a kind of what I call a ceremony light, LITE idea, where we start with a gong and sit for a couple of minutes, have a couple of tokes of cannabis, or offer some prayers actually, or
Yeah.
dedications to friends that are going through cancer or whatever.
Mm.
And then we have, like, literally, I have one toke to start off with. Adrian often has two, and then we sit in silence for another 5 to 10 minutes, and then we play songs for about an hour, and then we repeat that process and
Oh.
do a second half, as it were. So that's about what my involvement with music these days. Yeah.
Oh, it's a beautiful involvement. You just reminded me of another book you wrote, the Cannabis and Spirituality book,
Hmm.
which I really love seeing that, because I just feel like reconnecting with the cannabis as a spiritual ally
Hmm.
is not something that we're exposed to
Hmm.
in our society today. Like, when did you, kind of going back to your journey, when did you realize or discover cannabis as a spiritual ally? Like, was it always obvious?
No, I really liked that plant from the moment I first encountered it. Although, quite honestly, we don't need to go in this direction in our conversation, but it can be a tricky ally as well. It's often referred to as an enhancer or an amplifier, and I like the term non-specific amplifier, which is a term that's occasionally or often applied to psychedelics in general. So what that means is that there's a chemical explanation for that, but or biochemical. But what that means in the real world is that it amplifies any experience that you
Yeah.
have potentially, right? And that includes your thinking. And so if you're already going in a certain direction, it can amplify that direction. And if that direction is self-sabotaging, for example, like negative voices that you're
Yeah.
telling yourself, it can exaggerate or exacerbate those out of all proportion and make them seem really serious and really real and so on. And so I actually believe that cannabis triggered a relatively brief period of bipolar,
Mm.
what they used to call manic depressive at that time, where I'd swing back and forth between feeling like I was kind of on top of the world, couldn't imagine how I ever felt differently, and then something would happen. It's all completely ego based, right? It's like somebody says something to you or something doesn't go quite right, and the next thing you know, it's a couple of weeks of being depressed and feeling completely useless and going, I guess I don't know how I ever felt any different or ever will feel any different than that, right?
Yeah.
So it is a bit of a tricky ally, but when I was in university, I read a little book. I don't remember the name of it now, but it pointed out the kind of the spiritual connection. So I've always kind of had that in the back of my mind. But then starting, I don't know, about 15 or 20 years ago, I started thinking of cannabis more and more as this potential spiritual amplifier, you might say. And then it began to dawn on me that just what you said a few moments ago, which is that in general, people aren't aware of that side of its work, which takes a particular kind of focus and practice to evoke, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And yet it has thousands of years of that history in Asia primarily. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciated that. I could feel the awareness and the nuance when you were talking about working with the music. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
it was very disciplined in your approach, and there's a clear intent and prayer, and so I could see some of that work like seeping through. It's like, hey, no, it's like we were working with the plant, but we're also aware of what we were doing and how we are approaching it, which
Mm-hmm.
I think it's that's really important. And talking about so when you run, one of the things you do is you run cannabis ceremonies.
Uh-huh.
Um, Now, how does one of the ceremonies usually take place? Like, is it similar to other psychedelic ceremonies, or I'm just curious what your process is, or if you can share
Mm-hmm.
some of the highlights there.
Well, it kind of arose organically over time. Excuse me, I got a cough. Um, sorry. Uh, yeah, Well, let's see. Not specifically related. I've been around a lot of ceremonies, a lot of different kinds of
Yeah.
ceremonies, Buddhist meditation ceremonies of different kinds, Native American church peyote prayer ceremonies, the Santo Daime.
Mm.
I've been at the what do you call them, mestizo shamanism, in the Maloka type ceremonies down in South America. I've been around all kinds of environments of circles and different things like that, and I just kind of organically put it together. It actually started when I was putting together, and by the way, I'm not, I don't call myself exactly the author of these books, these last two. I call myself editor and contributor because there are 17 other contributors in
Yeah.
the cannabis book and 25, as you mentioned, in the new one, How Psychedelics Can Help Save the World. So, but I wanted to do it, I wanted to give people in the cannabis book some sense of what they could do if they were going to hold their own ceremonies. So I had some pretty good ideas, but I hadn't done it much. I'd done some very small things, kind of almost informally with one or two or three or four other friends or whatever. So I organized. I thought I need to have more hands-on experience to be able to give people some good guidance for that. So I got like 10 really interesting, good, solid, mature, psychedelic type people together, and did an all-day one where we also had a light edible to kind of keep us in the zone for longer. And so what we did with that was we combined silent, follow the breath type sitting meditation periods of short 5, 10, 15 minutes, and mix that up with things like some guided meditation,
Mm.
like breath guidance. And I have a favorite one where you visualize a white light coming in,
Mm.
etc., and work with that. And a couple of other similar practices, and also sound practices. I have crystal bowls and a couple of other different instruments, and one of those shruti boxes that do the drone,
Hmm.
and so we do some om chanting oftentimes. The whole intention and purpose of it, though, is to get one to focus outside of one's thinking mind. And this is relevant to the psychedelics as well, although strong psychedelics really don't leave you a lot of choice. If you get into your head, you're just going to be in major trouble. As Martina Hoffman, one of the contributors to the book, said once about ayahuasca, is the only way you can meet ayahuasca successfully is by completely surrendering to it.
Really.
If you that's when what we used to call back in the day with LSD, which was the primary psychedelic of the late 60s, early 70s, and was referred to as acid more likely than LSD, was a bummer. And a bum trip or a bummer, and that would come about because you got stuck in a place that scared you, and you got into a narrative about it, and then as an amplifier just sort of amplifies that out of all proportion, and it makes it seem terrifying or whatever. So with the cannabis ceremonies, the whole focus is about getting out of one's head as much as
Mm.
possible, which is a real challenge for almost everybody. But that's where, in my view, and I'm certainly not alone in that view, where this particular plant spirit ally does its best work, which is when you get yourself out of the way and just surrender to her. And that requires a certain level of focus or discipline to practice letting go of the thoughts. And it's particularly challenging with cannabis, unlike, say, other psychedelics, I think, in
Yeah.
that in the higher doses, especially of those psychedelics, you're not going to be, most people generally are not going to be like taking notes and writing things down. It's like, it's got you and it's taking you into a powerful place, right? Well, cannabis, for, except in extreme dosage situations, overdose or whatever, it doesn't compel you like that. You can step out of it or never get into it, for that matter,
Yeah.
So, and the tricky part is that it does stimulate creative thinking for so many people, and that can seem very compelling. But the problem with that is, and this is just universal teaching, especially articulated well by Buddhist teachings, is that the thinking mind is also ego's primary strategy for avoiding that surrender, for avoiding opening into the divine truth of how things are when you're not in your head spinning stories about what's real and what's not real, right? So there's this kind of fine line thing going on, where you think you're having these wonderful thoughts, and maybe you are, but at the same time, they might also be functioning to create a smokescreen between you and what you might call unconditional reality, or things as they truly are without your overlay of opinion or whatever that is, or belief, right? So that's why in the ceremonies, I really encourage people to, when they recognize a thought come up, no matter what it is, whether it's like the most brilliant thought you've ever had, or whether it's like, oh, I'm a loser, just for that little chunk of time, rare time when we're together, let it go. Let that thought go. And, it may come back in 10 seconds or a half a minute or 10 minutes, but that's the practice. That's actually basic meditation practice, follow the breath. Gently follow the breath. Notice when thoughts come up. Don't judge them. Release them and come back, because that's where the gap is that opens us up into potential connection with quote unquote reality, right? Yeah.
Yeah. No, this reminds me of the TM, Transcendental Meditation training. I don't know if we talked about the type of meditation last time, but I thought maybe we did. I don't know. Is your meditation practice transcendental meditation or Buddhist meditation?
With all due respect to TM, and I did do it back in the 70s, I got my mantra word and all that.
Yeah.
I consider that, no offense to the TM people, but the repetition of a mantra, it's a particular type of practice, and it's one of the practices that helps focus the mind. Buddhist teaching or Buddhist practices also have some chant practices and some visualization practices and things like that. Some of them are quite elaborate, actually. But the ultimate practice in the way it's taught in Tibetan Buddhism anyway, and I think that's generally what, people that really understand awakening would agree with, is that it's silent mind, like emptying into. Rumi, the great Persian mystic poet, he's got all kinds of wonderful lines about that. It's like, silence is the language of God, all else is poor translation, he says. And then other things like, don't let your thoughts cover the moon of your heart, let go of thinking, or let silence take you to the core of life. Silence meaning allowing that busy mind thing that, as I say, creates this sort of overlapping filters, that just create a smokescreen, or almost a wall in a way between us and the divine reality that it exists eternally and everywhere all the time, right? That's what we're aspiring toward. And so actually, I got rambling on that and forgot the question was. Yeah.
No, the question was around meditation and which
meditation,
practice.
Right?
And I like the clarification, because I've always felt when I practice, I still practice TM, but I practice understanding that it's a tool to almost keep part of your brain busy, but you're almost using that part of the brain you're using that tool, using that part of the brain, and while you're using it, it's using that part of the brain.
Exactly. That's what I was alluding to, is that in a sense, and again, no disrespect meant, to people practicing TM, that in a sense, it's kind of like training wheels, because as you say, you're replacing one thing with another thing, but ultimately then, even in the way the Tibetan Buddhist Vajrayana practice was laid out by my teacher, Chogyam Trungpa, was that you start with what they call shamatha practice. Shamatha is a Sanskrit word that means dwelling in peace. And that's the practice. You sit straight so that your energies move easily. You don't make a big deal about that. You don't have to be in full lotus or anything like that. It's not meant to be like this sort of sacred, holy practice or anything. It's just simply a way to discipline the mind to have enough presence of mind so that when you see the thoughts come up, as they inevitably will, you just look at them in a sense and then let them go. So, and use the breath as the medium of returning to present. And the breath, there's nothing better than breath, obviously, because it's going on all the time, 24 hours a day, part of the autonomic nervous system. You don't have to breathe. Breath breathes you, right? So it's not something that you have to put your mind on, of course, right? So it brings us back into the quote reality of being present in the space we're in. So thoughts come up and you just let it go immediately, right? In our particular practice, I mean, I could make a big long story about it, but the sort of simplest way to say it is that that teacher, Chogyam Trungpa, when he came to America, you saw how busy people's minds were. And so the first thing he did with his students, this is a story I heard, was he just had them sit with him. I don't know for how long, an hour or two, 3 a day, I don't know. And then he said, and these were just this few people had gathered around him in the very, very early days of his arrival in the United States. And he said, so how was that? And they said, oh yeah, well, our minds were all over the place, you know. And they said, okay, then let's add this. Pay gentle attention to your breath. Don't hyper focus on it. You know, just make it like a third of or a quarter of your attention. The rest, eyes open, just being in the room, because we're, again, not trying to create some holy practice here. We're just trying to create a practice that allows us to connect more with our real selves, in a sense, by seeing that thoughts are just stuff that arises. They're just temporary. They're just little vapor things. They're little clouds that come up, you know. So then he did that for a while, and he said, okay, so how was that? And they said, oh, well, that was better, but our minds were still kind of busy. So he said, okay, let's add one more little thing here. You don't know, you often aren't aware when you start thinking. You know, it's like it's like falling asleep. You know, no, you can't tell when you've fallen asleep, right? You know, I try. I lie in bed and I go, how will I know when I'm actually falling asleep? And the next thing you know, it's 3 hours later and you're waking up, right? So it's like that when oftentimes when you fall into, you know, going off into your head, when you're not really there, in a sense, right? You typically don't notice the beginning of that, but at a certain point you notice that you have been thinking, and it doesn't matter whether it's 10 seconds or 10 minutes. At that point, he said, just mentally label it thinking. So it's really clear that you've been in your head, not present in the room in that sense, and then just let it go and come back. So, and the way Tibetan Buddhism teaches that kind of a practice is at the beginning practice. Before you, maybe if you're in, you know, following the Vajrayana 3 vehicle or 3 yana path, you get into some more elaborate practices later. But the ultimate practice, which I never went that far, so I didn't actually do it, but it's called Mahamudra practice. Maha meaning great. I think that it's almost the same as the original shamatha practice. So it's like you're coming back full circle to just being present, right? Is the sort of the final practice, where you let everything go, all the practices, all the concepts, everything, and just practice being present. So that's what I'm trying to focus on, because cannabis, so where cannabis is so helpful, I think, potentially, although again, it's challenging because of the tendency to get the mind going too, for a lot of us. If you can channel that energy, that increased energy that you're gifted with for that little chunk of time there, then that amplification process allows you, or capability allows you, to go deeper than you might with just your quote unquote sober sitting meditation, right? Yeah.
I can definitely relate to that experience as well. I've never tried cannabis until it became legal in Washington, and I was meditating already, and I was like, oh, let's try these together.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it just helped me go much deeper, and the mantra was gone very quickly. I mean, it's just like, I love your analogy of the dream and falling asleep. Actually, not the dream, but falling asleep. It's like, do you know when that happens? And that's basically what happened. And it wasn't much. It doesn't need to be much necessarily to have
That's a good point.
An effect.
Yeah. A couple of summers ago, I did a 3-day solo meditation retreat up at a friend's cabin. So just starting at 9 in the morning or whatever, not brutalizing myself, not whipping myself or lying on a bed of nails, just
Thank
getting up
God.
and getting up and having breakfast and then sitting, like not starting at 4 in the morning or something, anyway, and then doing that all day into the evening till about 9 at night with a lunch and dinner break and maybe a walk to get some exercise for a little while. I did that for 3 days. And on the end of the third day, round about dinner time, going into my evening meditation, I had a couple of puffs, not super strong. And I sat and I thought, oh, this is actually the same. It's just slightly enhanced. It's exactly the same. That's so. So one of the terms I like to use for cannabis is I like to call it a reality medicine. When it's done that way, it's not like it takes you off into some other arbitrary, altered place. If you pay attention, if you can relax and calm your mind to a significant degree, hopefully, it takes you more deeply into this moment, so that if you're sitting outside and you hear the birds or you're looking at the flowers or whatever, then you appreciate those things potentially more deeply than you do normally when you're sort of kind of casual about them oftentimes, right?
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's beautiful. Now let's just switch now to psychedelics.
Yeah, yeah.
And because that's the latest book you co-authored.
Uh,
And in the introduction, I was reading you felt a pull. You felt a pull to write a book. Can you talk about that pull that you felt and what brought that pull upon you?
Yeah, sure. Well, that one can go way back to when I was a young man as well. Uh, yeah, I could again make a long story about this, but trying to keep it brief for the purposes of our conversation here. I was aware of the spiritual potential of psychedelics, when I was 20 or whatever. Most people weren't doing them that way, although they would tend to give you those kind of experiences anyway, oftentimes, even if you didn't pay attention to what's now considered to be de rigueur, set and setting, attention to set and setting. I assume most of your listeners will have heard that term, or viewers by now, but just in case, the short version is set is everything you bring to it, your intention in meeting that medicine, and the setting is the situation you actually do it in. So nobody knew the term particularly, although Timothy Leary and his friends had already come up with that term by then. But most people weren't paying attention to that particularly and doing it in any kind of circumstance. But it was known that you could have these experiences with LSD, again, particularly in those days, of what you might call spiritual experiences. And then I read a really interesting little book that I still have in my shelf behind me here, called Lazy Man's Guide to Enlightenment. And he worked with LSD a lot and pointed out how you could open up into that, again, unconditional reality, if you want to call it that. So I did have a couple of experiences back then when I worked with LSD that way, but really it was much later when I started to get interested well, actually, it was Terence McKenna that twigged me. So I'm trying to avoid making this too long of a story, but
Oh, that's fine.
yeah, okay, good. So at that time, we're talking late 60s, early 1970s, there was maybe you'd call it a meme going around in the sort of alternative communities, the psychedelic communities in particular, not that they were actually communities, but people using them, was that, so maybe you've had this experience of holiness or the divine or the ultimate reality or whatever, for a couple of hours or whatever on acid or some other similar substance. But what are you going to do with that? Like, the mere fact that you've had that experience doesn't necessarily change your life, right?
No.
It's an insight, it's a moment, so to speak, and you have to figure out how to live that. And so how are you going to do that? And if you're serious about it, what are you going to do? So for many people, it was some sort of a meditation practice, and that's what it was for me. And so that was part of what got me interested in Tibetan Buddhism. Like, how do you actually ground these experiences into your daily life that way? So, and once I got involved with the Tibetan Buddhist community and so on, they weren't encouraging the use of psychedelics at all, because they seemed to be part of that scattered mentality that a lot of people were prone to in those days. And so for 10 years, I didn't do anything. But then I found out, then I came upon the work of Terence McKenna. And McKenna put the two back together, the two meaning spiritual practice and psychedelic use. And he pointed out that, you know, communities all over the world, tribal communities, etc., had been using these substances for spiritual and healing use for thousands of years, oftentimes. And that got me back on that path. And then it just kind of went from there. I did a couple of ayahuasca sessions in the 90s. Got in around about 20 years ago, got connected to the Native American Church with the peyote prayer ceremonies, and those people can create an amazing container for that kind of work.
Yeah.
And more recently, the ayahuasca Santo Daime, ayahuasca using Santo Daime Church, which also has a very strong, safe container for doing that work. And so I just got more and more involved in them as time went along. And then I got asked to help organize this conference in 2011 that I'm still doing now, like 13 years later, called the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference here in Vancouver. And so, and through that, I just got connected to a lot of really interesting people, some leaders in the field, you know, Dennis McKenna, Wade Davis, Chris Beisch, all these different people. So many of the people that have spoken at the conference are also in the book. I think 14 of the people that are in the book have at one time or another spoken at that conference. So I just got more deeply involved in psychedelics. And one simple way to answer your question is that I might even have put, yes, I think I did put this in the intro to the book, that you know, and this is actually central to the purpose of the book, or the mission of the book, you might say, is that we are in a difficult situation on the planet. That might be an understatement. We're arguably at a crisis moment, a nexus point, actually. Several of the contributors, particularly Chris Beisch, allude to that in the book, but it's something that's being talked about a lot in spiritual work and environmental work and psychedelic work and so on, is that and certainly indigenous people have been telling this to us for 500 years or more, is that this is the crunch time. We've, you know, abused the planet so badly and overrun it with, you know, more than 8 billion people on it. Our future depends on a consciousness change. Our future depends on enough human beings recognizing our actual relationship to the planet and to spirit, recognizing that we are, as one contributor to the book, Tyson Yunkaporta, calls it, a custodial species. Mm-hmm. We are responsible for the welfare and the care of this planet. And people all over the world historically have understood that in tribal communities, that they are embedded in the world and responsible for maintaining and caring for the world around them. But we, for a whole bunch of reasons that we don't want to get into, I don't think, in this conversation, in these quote unquote dominant big civilization cultures, et cetera, have lost that connection. That's a whole story that I'm very interested in, some of the origins of how that probably developed, but you know, that could be a long discussion. So
I am too, but you're right.
Yeah. Well, let me put it this way, really briefly then. There's a lot of people talking about this from different angles. One, you might call this a fable or an origin myth almost. Up until around the time of Christ, there were pagan cultures all over Europe, the Middle East, and many other places that were essentially free of the kind of repressive dogma that the Christian church brought in. People like the science fiction novelist Philip K. Dick called it the Black Emperor or the demiurge, the false jealous god that wants. It's the control element or mentality in human beings that thinks that by controlling the outer world one can control oneself, and it's not true. It's a grand illusion. But when people gain power, they attempt to do that. So they become extremely heavy-handed and authoritarian and dogmatic about that. So this idea is that perhaps for the last 2,000 years or so, we've been kind of frozen in under the thumb of the patriarchy, of the authoritarian mentality, the control mentality, but that has come to a head now. So where psychedelics come into that is that if they're done right for most people that use them, they reconnect you to that lost connection of our embeddedness and everything, to spirit, to planet, to earth, to other beings. We start to, it's often said that psychedelic users tend to become more concerned about the environment, for example, than they were before that. So one way that I think of it is that when we've come to, if you take the metaphor of an illness, say a cancer, when the patient is in a more advanced or serious or grave state of illness, strong medicines are required. So psychedelics are the strongest medicines we have, the strongest modalities, you might say. Not in a sense putting down any other way of just simply meditating or whatever, but because of this amplification capability, it's like they allow us potentially to go into the deeper places that are already there. We just have shut them down before, right? So they're really important right now, and also for that reason, really important to be stewarded and educated about carefully and responsibly and humbly, without greed, in a sense. You have to be careful that corporate interests don't take over this work too much, or medical bureaucracies don't completely take over this work, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that's kind of the answer as to why I got into it and why I consider these substances so important, is that they just simply are amplifiers, and they're these amazingly powerful tools if you know how to channel it, if you know how to use them and work with them.
No, true. Was there a specific moment that you can go back to where you're like, I got to bring those people together. I got to share that message. Was there a moment crystallized in your mind of that you received a calling, or you talk about Chris Besh in there as supporting you in your journey.
Well, Chris is, if any of the other contributors to the book are going to watch this, happen to watch this, then no offense to any of them, but Chris is key for me in that sense. So there was a moment that I made the definite decision to do it. I've been sort of boiling up in my mind for at least a couple of years, to participate in that vision, I guess you could say, share something about that. Chris has spoken at our conference 3 times now. So he first came in 2018, and I also interviewed him for my YouTube channel, and had a fair amount of communication with him. And he has this remarkable book called LSD and the Mind of the Universe. And I, for one thing, I just love the guy. He's a wonderful human being. He's so kind. He walks the talk. It's not just a bunch of ideas. And so I have an immense respect for Chris. He's a really intelligent guy as well. So he was a really good writer, a really clear writer. He's just not flowery, but he's really clear. And his visions are real. I mean, his understanding is real, in my opinion. So for your viewers' benefit, basically, I'll give you the sort of the hopefully under 50-word version of that. he's now retired. He was a professor of religion and philosophy, I believe, at Ohio State University in Youngstown, Ohio. That was his career. Early in his career, he decided to undertake the Stanislav Grof protocol of working with LSD, which is safe place, safe container, with a sitter, high dose, eye shades to keep out external light, and a carefully curated playlist of appropriate music. And then do that like on a Saturday, and then on the Sunday, spend the whole day transcribing it carefully, even putting the headphones back on again. So go, oh yeah, that song triggers that memory of that particular vision, etc. He did that 73 times over 20 years, and with 500 to 600 micrograms of acid, which is LSD, which is very high dose for most people. And basically what he describes is that in each one of those 73 encounters, the first couple of hours were often very difficult. I think he said even extremely painful sometimes, because he had to let go of everything he associated with the identification of Chris Beish, the Chris Beish ego. Who am I? What do I know? All that stuff. He had to just dissolve out of that. Ego death, they call it, right? But then it went even deeper than that. He had to kind of, in a sense, die to his identity even as a human, like the species ego. But for whatever reason, he was able to hang in there for that without freaking out, calling 911 or whatever, and after 2 hours, he broke out into what I sometimes refer to, I think he refers to it once or twice, as the vast intelligences of the universe. Mm-hmm. And over that 20-year period, they increasingly strengthened the downloads that he got as he learned to become comfortable in that zone, because it was very high energy. Like literally, he said one time it took him a year to recover after one of the sessions, because literally it's like lightning going through you, I guess. It's physically incredibly demanding. He said, I wouldn't recommend anyone doing this, and he said, I don't even think I'd do this again if I had the choice to do lesser dosages. But I think it was completely worth it, because what he started to download was, especially in the later third of those 20 years, was that we are going into a death and rebirth cycle on this planet, that hundreds of thousands of years of development and karma, et cetera, and accumulated knowledge and wisdom are all coming to a head right now. And that we are on the cusp of a vast, radical change on this planet. It's likely to be very difficult for a time. It's often compared to a birth, where there's immense amount of pain for the mother, and then there's this blood and screaming and everything. And if you popped in from another planet where they didn't do that and looked at this, you'd go, holy, that's a terrible thing, but then out comes new life, right?
Yeah.
So that's what the kind of vision that Chris, and actually many other people, including the indigenous people that I mentioned earlier, have had a similar kind of a vision, that this is the crunch time. We're going to go through what would probably be a very difficult time in terms of letting of the death, so to speak, of these ways that we've been living and working on this planet that are dysfunctional and non-sustainable. So that letting go and the dying and falling away of all that could be very difficult on the material level. The climate itself is making life difficult, obviously, and will probably get increasingly extreme. But what it's pushing us to do is to wake up to who we really are, and then start acting like that custodial species that we are supposed to be. So the reason for the book and the reason for these medicines is that they potentially, well, the medicines, I mean, but the mission of the book is because I think what's likely to happen in this next several decades is that people are going to become increasingly unanchored to things that give them sort of stability and status quo comfort, and that sort of thing. And so, and we're already seeing that. This is a chaotic culture we live in with no overarching kind of vision for who we are. This is an odd one. Christian religion used to be the dominant force in a sense, and although in general, most people practicing that religion didn't really know their true selves. It was a set of beliefs up here, still provided a degree of moral value, right? Yeah. And if you look back at the 1950s, sitcoms, for example, they were extremely narrow, and they were the middle class, materialistic life, but they were morally focused. The good father would have some message for his wayward children, like, "Oh, son, this is the lesson here," And so we've become increasingly unanchored. And so there is, studies are showing there's a great increase in depression and anxieties among younger people, and so on and so on. So people need a message that's believable, that's understandable, and that shows that we are not just going to hell as a species, that we're actually going into a transformation time. And so the more people can get that message and then make it real in their practice, hence psychedelics again, the more the species has a chance of creating what one of the other contributors in the book, Duane Elgin, calls, a mature planetary civilization. Duane's chapter is really interesting because he doesn't even mention psychedelics in it. He lays out what he thinks could happen in the next 60 to 70 years, where the increasing difficulty over the next several decades leads to increasing creativity, innovation, determination, conviction, the risal of our best qualities to deal with extreme difficulties, right? Survival will kick in more and more. And so the best of us will come out more and more, ideally, right? And that if things go well, if enough people get the message and act on it and work for it, then we may be able to we may see the evolution or development of a mature planetary civilization in 50 or 60 years from now. But, who knows?
You touched, that's what I love of this book. There's so much in it, and I've just scratched the surface. And it's just really well written, everything, all parts of it. And like everything I was reading, I was like, oh, this is great. But it's also a fine line, and you touched on that when putting a book like that together, because you don't want to come across as like, hey, it's doomsday, we're all going to hell. And at the same time, you want to talk about what we can do moving forward. And at the same time, and you touched on that, I think, even though the book is called, how psychedelics can help save the world, you mentioned in the introduction, they're just one of the actors. They're not it's not just about psychedelics. And so I'm really curious how you approached that balance as you were editing the book, and maybe some of the choices you had to make as you were putting this together. That must, there's an art to that, and I'm curious how you went about it.
Okay, sure. Thanks for the question. Well, first of all, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the people who are in the book are people I already knew from the conference over the years. And I thought those, so I knew what they had to say in general about these medicines. So that was the starting point for a lot of them. And secondly, then I put it out to them when I communicated with them, like via email or whatever. This is the mission of the book. The mission of the book is to address our crisis and how psychedelics can be of use in that. And by the way, just for a point of clarification, I include cannabis in that pantheon of psychedelic medicines. Sticklers, chemists or whatever would say, whoa, no. Psychedelics are substances which act on the 5-HT2A receptor system or whatever. I'm not a chemist, whatever. I only know that much. And cannabis does not. And in fact, not all of the quote unquote
ketamine as well.
Some others.
Ketamine.
I'm not sure if peyote even does, because it's not a tryptamine hallucinogen. I don't actually know that, but in any case, functionally speaking, in real world terms, I consider cannabis a psychedelic. Psychedelic from the Greek means soul or mind manifesting. The other term that's sometimes used is entheogens, and en meaning in, theo meaning God, gen meaning generate. So generating or connecting to the divine within ourselves. Cannabis can do that. So, I don't want to go on about that right now, but there are 2 chapters in the book by people who are work with cannabis that way. And so as far as the what you call the fine art of putting it all together, is, as I say, it was really a lot of people that I already knew, and then putting out that kind of overarching mission to them, so that they're understood that they're in their chapter that they would write, they would either indirectly or directly, but often indirectly, put it in the context of that larger picture. So Bill Bernard, for example, a wonderful guy, wonderful writer. He's a professor in, I think, Austin, Texas. And he's also the head of a Santo Daime church there, the ayahuasca people. And he uses this word in his chapter. Actually, the chapter, I think, is called Becoming Divine. So he's taking the more directly spiritual angle on it, and he uses the word divinization. That is the goal of work with psychedelics, is to become divine in that sense, to connect with our true selves. And I say at the almost other end of that continuum, you have Dwayne Elgin with his chapter where he doesn't even mention psychedelics, just that here's what's probably going on. And then Chris Beisch, of course, who has the big vision of the death and rebirth cycle, and explains that so eloquently and articulately. Zoe Helene, I know, I've known Zoe, it's actually pronounced Helena, I believe. I've known her for years. She's helped me find great women to speak at the conference, and her thing is psychedelic feminism. In fact, I think she says she coined the term psychedelic feminism. So her chapter addresses psychedelics, but also, and how they work in certain ways, but also the need for gender balance. That the work isn't going to proceed very well without that full recognition of gender respect and balance, parity, et cetera, et cetera. Because in a sense, that's one of the things that psychedelics do, is they, the macho guys may not like to hear this, but in a sense, they feminize you, because, our culture is over masculinized for both men and women, I would say, in the sense that we don't necessarily trust our feeling senses, our intuition, as much as they are there to be accessed. Opening up to how we feel our way into the world rather than think our way into the world, and that's a disease, you might say, that affects pretty much everybody. So psychedelics potentially open up the receptive in us, to experience things, at a deeper level, felt experience at a deeper level. So, I could go on, but there's, everybody comes at it from a slightly different angle throughout the book. Wade Davis, the wonderful, legendary anthropologist, holder of the prestigious Order of Canada, written many books, like 24 or more books on cultural and biodiversity on this planet, and worked with psychedelics a lot when he was younger. He was actually one of the kind of pioneers. It was before the hippies kind of really got rolling, I guess. Well, maybe not before, but before. He probably did ayahuasca decades before most people did, and he did it in South America as an anthropologist. Anyway, he writes about the history of some of these pioneers, Richard Schultes and so on, and then puts it in the context, because Wade has had probably still does, but has spent much time with indigenous people in South America and knows a lot about how their worldview and so on, and how psychedelics were part of their culture, or what we call psychedelics. So he writes somewhat about that as well. So yeah, just many different angles. And even at the very, very end, I wanted to put something about maintaining your sense of humor, because if you take all this stuff too seriously, and especially oneself, then you're just missing the point on some level. I think I heard you just recently say something like, I can't listen to anyone who doesn't have a sense of humor, you know. So Adam Strauss, who's a wonderful psychedelic comedian, has this fantastic one-man show that he's been doing for about 10 years called The Mushroom Cure, about how psilocybin mushrooms helped him manage and, I don't know if cure, he used the word cure anyway in his title there, but his extreme OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Yeah. So he's in at the end. And actually the very final chapter, even after that, I think it's the last one. Bruce Damer, who's an amazing, brilliant guy, has done software programs for NASA, for example. He's just like a brainiac, the guy, but also incredibly sensitive, like tuned in to energies in that way. He's very open about this. I'm not giving away any state secrets here. He was definitely borderline autistic or somewhere on the autistic spectrum growing up, but really tuned into energies, that most people weren't picking up on at all. Anyway, he has a chapter in the book as well. And then I knew this little anecdote from him, and I asked him if he would write another little short chapter for the very end. And it's a story about, he knew Terence McKenna personally, and also I think he's holding Terence's archives. So he's very connected to Terence. And when Terence died of a massive, terrible frontal lobe brain cancer of some kind or another, inoperable, et cetera, when he was about 52, I think, something like that. And he was right near the end, when he was almost gone, and he was not lucid a lot of the time, drugged, et cetera. Something like this, he sat up. Bruce wasn't there, but he got this from, he knew the people who were there in the room with Terence. Terence, who, if anyone knows his work, had been sort of the great psychedelic philosopher, and a lot of speculative philosophy, a lot of really wild and interesting ideas of where we came from and where we're going as a species, et cetera, the end of time, the meeting with God, all these really fascinating ideas, much of it, in a sense, speculative. So he sits up, this is, I don't know how long, very near the end of his life, like I think very near. And he says, sort of wide-eyed, and he says, psychedelics, they're not about all those ideas. They're not about that stuff at all. They're about love. And that's basically how the book ends, except for a little in conclusion chapter from me. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's the other aspect of it. In fact, Julie Holland wrote the intro for the book. Pardon me, not the intro, the foreword. And that's what that's her focus in the foreword, is that, in fact, she quotes an old pop song called, what the world needs now is love, sweet love, right? Yeah. And that's central, because that's, the sort of power of love is what's often, well, almost always to some degree or another, buried in us, the sort of universal compassion, you might say, which ties in with one sense of appreciation deepening with the psychedelics as well, is central to the change that it seems we need to go through on the planet now.
Yeah. No, I love what what you're touching on. Everything you're touching on, the lightheartedness also that you touched on is really important. It's something, I know we have a mutual acquaintance. I attended his ceremonies. He's a Native American chief, and he would always finish the ceremony in the morning with jokes, but jokes
Mm-hmm.
where you learn,
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
teaching jokes.
Yeah, that's
And
good.
I was like, like after you've done ayahuasca and gone through the surrender and gone through, all the different phases that, many people go through when they work with those medicine, um, bringing it back to that lightheartedness is important. That's important because,
Hmm.
with a light heart and the journey we have ahead of us, I think those two go together. Like we have a lot of work to
Hmm.
do.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's central. Well, in fact, not well, lightheartedness is a nice way to put it. I like the word joy. Just
Joy.
that simple
Yeah.
little three-letter word, joy. I think, and when I say think, I don't live in a state of, bliss and joy all the time, but I dip in and out of that kind of state. Sometimes I like to think that I'm in a state of quiet joy, as I call it. Um, but I know enough about it from my experiences, and as do many people, if not almost everybody, has had some experience of joy. Well, I think what the teachers are saying, the great teachings are saying, is that is our natural state, is to be in a state of joy. But it's not, some like skeptical people or cynical people even would maybe say, "Oh yeah, well that's very all nice and sweet, walk around in a state of joy." But it's like seeing the world through rose-colored glasses. It's a grand illusion in this tragic world. No, that's not it. Joy is, I think, and again, speaking from a partial understanding, quite honestly, as I understand it, joy is our natural state when we have freed ourselves from all the burdens that we lay on ourselves. So, lightheartedness, in a sense, is a good word for that too, because it's a lightening of our burden, right? Um, but it's not self-absorbed or
Yeah.
kind of like, oh, I don't care about the world because I'm happy. It's the opposite. My old Buddhist teacher was really good on that. He talked about allowing yourself to be touched by the world, and he said that joy in an awakened person is mixed with sadness. And
Yeah.
if I understood it correctly, what he meant is it's not sadness for yourself. It's not like, oh, poor me. It's sadness for the tragedy that the gift of life, the gift of that joy, the gift of that ability to be at peace and thoroughly embrace this life, you know, in a connected, joyful, compassionate, creative way, is is beyond the reach of almost everybody to one degree or another.
Yeah.
And in a sense, that's the tragedy of this life: is that the ego mind that has made up its own. This is why I mentioned this demiurge way back near the beginning of our conversation. The false god that thinks it knows and it tries to control. We're all trying to control our lives to one degree or another. But by letting go of that control, we discover the true gift of life, I believe. And that's, I think, what makes an awakened person experience this mix of joy and sadness as well, for caring for the world in that sense, right? I,
Yeah.
I love you, world.
And there's plenty of opportunities for that joy and sadness right now, and
Mhm.
yeah, well, you just took me out to why I'm not necessarily watching the news anymore,
Mm.
because I just feel like, I mean, there's a lot of manipulation in how the news is delivered too, and
Mhm.
um, but the sadness, I mean, people are like, well, you're sticking your head in the sand. I'm like, I'm not. It's just,
Mm-mm.
it's like
Mm.
I know what's going on. I'm very well aware. it
Mhm.
it hurts, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of work to do. It hurts. I don't
Mhm.
need to be necessarily reminded every day with manipulated propaganda.
Mm-mm.
But yeah, no, I
Yeah.
really like how you brought that mix, or your teacher, your teachings, his teachings brought that mix
Mhm.
together of joy and sadness. So there's a light heart at times that's needed, but there's that awareness that we
Mhm.
are connected, and we're not achieving our full potential And that's even sounds wrong when I say that, because when you know, when I'm saying our full potential, it means, you know, like there's biohacking and trying to reach higher and higher. And but like as humans, like we're amazing species, and you talk about that in the book, the term, not you but somebody else, custodial
Yeah, that was Tyson Yunkaporta.
species.
Yeah.
Can you touched on that already? Can you expand a little bit? Is it, who are you the custodian of? Who
Well,
yourself, our bodies, and
Well,
the
that's a
or
starting point, and I don't let me forget. You know,
okay,
if I lose my train of thought on your question there, but I want to take a slight
yeah,
angle on that. In terms of what we were just talking about, the joy and the sadness.
yeah,
I think what we're going to see going forward is that there will be increasing seductions to feel fear and anxiety and confusion. Um, and so, what Buddhists sometimes call mind protection will become increasingly important. I think, and again, you know, I'm not standing on the top of the mountain looking down and saying, "Hey, folks, I know all this. You know, I'm enlightened or whatever." But I think I do have enough of an understanding to know that we all have this potential to remain in. Again, I'll quote my old teacher or reference him, in our seats, to hold your seat, right? That is how we look after ourselves, what you might call self-care. So you have to start with self-care. You have to start with unburdening yourself of what's standing in the way of you and being a dignified, authentic presence in this on this planet, which, as I understand it from the teachings and from my own glimpses and blah blah, is a person who is holding their dignified seat, who is at peace, basically, you know, and with that freeing up of the burdens that we've placed on ourselves, the chains that we've wrapped ourselves in, from the moment we were born and over many past lives, people would say, we are able to stay present, and it brings, it naturally comes with compassion. You know, peace and love were these old sort of two hippie words that went together, you know, and people think, yeah, cutesy, you know, love it. No, it's real.
yeah,
That's what people experienced when they had deep experiences with psychedelics, was that when you dipped into this timeless space of ultimate peace. Even Jesus nailed, not even Jesus, I mean, somehow it escaped the hegemony of the authoritarians, that Jesus said, the peace, this is the peace that passes all understanding. There's no way to understand it. It's just who we are when you can actually, when you've freed yourself of all those burdens, and you can relax into that state of peace. Psychedelics have elicited that in me and many other people as well, again temporarily, but you go, okay, now we know that's real. You know, it's not a theory, it's not a belief system, it
yeah,
doesn't belong to any religion whatsoever. So that's our challenge going forward, is I think anyone who's capable of it at all is to recognize that no matter what's happening out there, we have the responsibility and the ability ultimately to encourage, nurture, deepen, and ultimately, hopefully, remain in that centered, holding our seat state while this other stuff happens, so that we can actually be of use rather than sort of
yeah.
victimized by our own terror or whatever the heck it is, right? And so I did forget the other part of your question now.
That's okay. You touched on it earlier, but I love this, the centering. Also, like I feel
Mhm.
like we're so off our center as well,
Yeah.
and it's the lives we live in
Hmm.
puts us off that center. And some days we can feel it. We can feel
Yeah.
how we're off our center. We wake up,
Yeah.
we're like, oh, I feel different. But like some people, I call it either center or baseline, but some people have moved so far away from that center or baseline that they've forgotten
Hmm.
what it feels like. And what I like with the psychedelic experiences, they bring you back to that center. They bring you back
Potentially.
to
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
potentially creating from center, expressing that love from a
Hmm.
place that is centered. Um, so as we move forward, um, Do you think that the solution to our or part of the great transition, I think you used the word great transition. Oh, you wanted to say something.
I would just remember why part of your original question a moment ago was about what does this mean to be a custodial
Yes.
species, right? So that's where I got a little distracted by saying that the first thing you got to custodialize is oneself, right? That's self-care, that's mind protection, and all that. But then I was going to use an example. There's a wonderful writer named Martin Prechtel, Prechdel, spelt Martin, but pronounced Martine. Anyway, he's still around, but for 13 years he was, for most of those 13, first of all trained, and then for a large chunk of the 13 years he was in a village in Guatemala, and he was the shaman for the village, as well as a number of other involvements. He's actually half Native American from the US, and he eventually had to come back because the juntas and paramilitaries were destroying all these villages, and all his friends said, Martin, you got to get out and take this knowledge with you, and share it with the world. So what Martin said about those people and their worldview was, like, just like almost everywhere in this bloody world, the missionaries would come with their humorless, that's an important point, attempt to convert people to their humorless, serious, view of the world. And the Maya were going, we can't relate to you at all. You're telling us that we got kicked out of the garden, for our sins. We don't see it that way at all. We see that we are in the garden. This is the garden. And we don't have to keep changing it and quote unquote improve it. What we need to do is love it and care for it, maintain a healthy relationship with it, be sacramental about the way that we do things, and the way that we plant things, and the way that we look after our seeds, and et cetera, and each other. So that seems to be kind of like the central issue here, right? That we are in the garden, we are a custodial species, and this planet now is this whole planet is now our garden. That's what people are trying to do by working toward net zero emissions and other environmental initiatives. That's all part of it. I just think, and as do many others, that the psychedelics can help in the sense that from the inside out, they deepen people's connection with, that love for the planet, that kind of joy and sadness mixed together. Like, oh my God. I mean, I sometimes feel that way about what we've done to the planet. I mean, go back, I don't know, maybe not that far, but let's say 1,000 years.
I don't think you have to go back far.
But imagine what this planet looked like 1,000 years ago. Covered in pristine forests, old growth forests, pure water, except for when somebody's cows were shitting in it and it poisoned the stream, but in general, water, this incredible gift of life everywhere on the planet, pure, crystal clear water, clear skies, incredible nature everywhere. And it's been so degraded that in itself is heartbreaking, So it's our job, I think, is to in whatever way we can do it. And it's not, one doesn't have to be sort of narrow focused on what that is. I don't know all the different ways that people can help. Maybe creating great art, can help. Writing, nonfiction, fiction books, environmental activism, creating spiritual communities, whatever, maybe there's 1,000 ways, or people just focusing on how they are in their personal lives with the people around them without, going beyond that, just treating people with respect and kindness, even simple things, just like down at the store, you go down to the corner to buy some groceries. You don't have to be humorless. You can say hello to those people. I end up, even though it's only, you're only with them for 60 seconds or whatever, while they're, tallying your groceries, I get into conversations with those people, as often as I can, if they're open to it, ask them how they're doing and say, oh, I see you got your hair cut, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. No, like
Yeah.
you answered many questions in one. I love it, because you do mention that sense of coming home several times in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know if it was actually, I think it's in the book, or in the when we talked before, but like, psychedelics help you realize you're already home.
Mm-hmm.
You are home, and that goes back to the custodial
Yeah.
aspect you're talking about, and the kindness. I would add to that we're so quick at judging now too, which just I see that every day now. There's training somehow of like
Mm.
just jumping on the sensational and judging and trying to make up your mind, and we've all been trained to just go after that. And I feel like it goes back to what you were saying earlier of like maintaining our center and kind of awareness, but also not being caught in the strong currents
Mm-hmm.
that are around us.
Yeah, one of the I keep referring to this Buddhist teacher Chogyam Trungpa, and the reason is because he is the single most important influence in my life, even though he's been dead for 37 years or 36 years now. And one of the things he said was that a sign that you're actually progressing on the path, if that's even a correct way of thinking of it, is that you become less opinionated, and that the opinions that you do have, you don't take as seriously as you did before, right? And then again, as I mentioned earlier, somehow or another, after 2,000 years of control from above in the Christian institution, um, real good teachings came through apparently from Jesus anyway. And one of them was, judge not, lest ye be judged. And the way I understand that one is that um, it's an unarguable principle, which is if you're judging, that's a state of mind. So that's your state of mind, right?
Yeah.
So if you're in that judgmental state of mind, that's what you're experiencing, right? Um,
Yeah.
so regardless of the effect that it has on anybody else, it may have no effect whatsoever on them. In most cases, it doesn't, because you don't have any contact with that person. You're just judgmental, but you're the one experiencing the judgmentalness. So your judge not lest you be judged, I think means that judged in a sense by yourself,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's been on my mind a lot last few days. As there's, an event that's happened that's very polarizing with a
Mm-hmm.
famous figure of peace and happiness, and everybody's ready to.
Oh, yeah, the Dalai Lama.
Yeah, the Dalai
Yeah, yeah,
Lama. Yeah. And
yeah.
it brings the reactions to the event for me has brought a lot of sadness. Just like,
Mm.
like you talk about the sadness is, it's like, wow, it, I don't want to, it's hard not to judge the reaction of judging, and then, just being at peace and just observe, which I think,
Hmm.
goes back to a lot of the teachings we
Yeah,
discuss too.
yeah. I think there's an important clarification regarding judgment, though. Um, Buddhist teachings have a term called discriminating awareness. I think it's called prajna in Sanskrit. Um, dis- Discriminating awareness, uh, the word judging can be tricky, what it actually means, because you are, in a sense, discriminating things, like you could see things, ideally you're seeing things, if you're seeing things clearly without the overlay of a judgmental mind state, so to speak, or opinions, but you're just seeing things as they are, then you're going to see malfeasance or whatever,
Yeah.
right? Um, so that's discriminating awareness, and it's not like we're supposed to just like, oh, everything's all groovy.
Yeah.
We're actually, the more we wake up and unburden ourselves of all these conflicting beliefs and concepts in our minds, the more we can see clearly um, in general, and that is that we can, in a sense, judge, but not in that way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, I get it.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I like the clarification. It's a good one because so many times people have had psychedelic ceremonies. They have
Mhm.
one of the reflections you can have during those ceremonies is about judgment.
Mhm.
And you'll think about afterwards. It's like, well, what is judgment? What is and you'll have those deep reflection around judgment. And I've gone through that a few times. Well, I shouldn't call it judgment. Then I should just call it observing
Mhm.
without judgment. But at
Mhm.
the same time, I like the way you put it. And when you're talking about a great transition that's upon us, and you're talking about where we are, bringing it back to the book as
Yeah.
a race, a relationship with the planet that's taken care of us for so many years, us plundering the planet for so many years. There needs to be, there's a set of facts, irrefutable facts, and knowing where you're at. I mean, one calls it a judgment, I guess. Clear judgment is important to help
Mhm.
us move forward.
Yeah, well, you mentioned earlier, that it can be problematic paying attention to the quote news, and I think I agree with you in general. Um, but I think paying attention also, like, to what's being said from wherever it's coming from, is also valuable for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Not everybody, some people just do your practice, live your life with dignity, um, and calmness and compassion, and help where you can help. But for people like myself, I want to know what's going on around the world. I want to know what's going on, what trends are happening, like, that, the rise of dictators, or, whatever. I do pay attention. I read the,
Yeah.
I skim through the New York Times online edition. I skim through parts of the New Yorker. Alternate is another one that I pay attention to, et cetera, et cetera. Along with reading books like the one I'm reading now called The Psychedelic Connection. Stuff like, or The Psilocybin Connection. So yeah, or great books on history, or a new view of history, like this book that I just finished reading. What's it called? The Dawn of Everything, which is really interesting. Not an easy read. It's long. It's about 500 pages. But these two authors, Wengrow, and I've forgotten the other guy's name. Uh, they point out that that the narrative of that there's been a linear progression from sort of the crude caveman life to this modern civilization, and that it inevitably results in hierarchical structures, is not the historical facts. There have been cultures all over the place, all over, for a long, long time, that have had a more or less non-hierarchical, community-based, more or less egalitarian, fairly free in that sense. Anyway, so
Yeah.
I read all that kind of stuff.
No,
Yeah.
that sounds refreshing, and I definitely took notice to that when you talked about your daily routine. I was like, oh, that's nice. He's staying connected, and he's reading the news and staying connected with the world as part of the daily routine.
Yeah.
Um, Moving
Because if you
forward,
don't know, no, just to finish
yeah,
up
yeah,
on that, if you're not hearing what the scientists are saying about, melting ice caps and warming ocean temperatures. I mean, I just read something a couple of days ago that, we had ocean temperatures just broke a record. World ocean temperatures are warmer than ever. Um, let's not hide our heads in the sand. I mean, this is the work ahead, right?
absolutely,
Is that pay attention, look after yourself so that you don't get freaked out, or if you you see yourself starting to get freaked out, you can at least recognize it and come back to your holding your seat, right?
yeah, yeah,
And then paying attention that the work needs to be done,
yeah.
and anyone who can, let's do it, whatever you can do.
So, taking the vision of the book and kind of going through that great great transition forward.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Do you think, like, how do you see it that it could play out? I mean, with psychedelics, I'm always trying to, this is more my thinking mind. It's like, well, do we have leaders taking psychedelics, and then is there a ripple effect, or how does the ripple effect of psychedelic plays out in a way that can make enough of a ripple, that it can turn into a wave and it can turn things around? Because it's, like there's ceremonies that by nature right now they're not scalable, and this is my favorite way to experience psychedelics. And then there's what I call the pharma 2.0, who's got all those new molecules and everything that's trying to help people on the other hand in a scalable way, but there's greed in there as well. How do you see this play out in the next 30, 50 years?
Oh boy, geez, that's a
big
tough
question.
one. I don't know. Yeah, no,
I don't know either. That's what
I don't think humans are very good at predicting the future in some ways. So it would be a little bit arrogant of me to and deluded to claim that I do know. But you mentioned a term or something in that the lead up to that question about the sort of filtering down idea. Well, maybe filtering through might be a slightly more a way that I could relate to that concept a little more. But down, in a sense, also applies in the sense that, yes, you're right. The number of people that, compared to the 8 billion people that are on the planet who are going to be influenced by psychedelics and able to participate and have an influence on the consciousness change that needs to take place on the planet are few, extremely few, right? So yes, in a sense, it filters out. But people are influenced everywhere, and well, this is another whole sort of theme, but I'll try to keep it brief. I don't think it's a complete coincidence or random that an idea or a piece of information can be spread around the whole planet in a second, right? So there's one of my favorite sayings, I think I mentioned it in the intro, is was it Victor Hugo? I keep getting mixed up with my, yeah. Anyway, he was a 19th century philosopher, and he said there's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come. Right. And so the other way that I've been kind of tying that into the visions and the prophecies and all that is that people are saying that there's going to be room for the new vision to be understood as there's more of a, in a sense, crack in the way things are now. And that's what's happening. The stability and believability of the current way that we have been living and running this planet, so to speak, is becoming increasingly less stable and functional and supportive and so on. And as that happens, there's the potential for people going completely haywire, of course, and following demagogues like Donald Trump and others. But this is why the message is so important, to point out that there is this potential for an opening as well, and that when we start to experience that opening, we realize it just simply feels far better to be connected to ourselves, and to be experiencing some sense of that peace and that compassion and that participation in the healing of the world, right? I mean, so as far as I'm concerned, the notion that there's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come will increasingly dawn on people.
Yeah.
That there's this one thing, in a sense, that we've been missing all these thousands of years, which is that we are, as the Buddhists would put it, Buddha. Buddha it's the Sanskrit word that just means awake. It's like, oh, that's why you mentioned coming home, because sometimes the psychedelics give you that experience where you just feel, you can't explain this. It's the peace that passes all understanding, but it's real.
Yeah.
It's it's unarguable, it's unimpeachable.
And yeah, I love that quote from Victor Hugo.
Yeah.
I'll take advantage of my French roots here.
Yeah, good one, good one.
It's wonderful because when I look at, I'll go back to the Leadershipedelics show. The premise of the show, which we've never talked with each other, and so the premise before the show, and so the premise of the show was to actually help people, communities, and leaders manifest a
Hmm.
better future for
Right.
themselves, their family, their community, and at work.
Yeah.
And it's all entwined with psychedelics and leadership.
Hmm.
Uh, and a lot of that was kind of a calling from working with plant medicine. And
Hmm.
and I read your book, and I'm like, oh my God, like, this is much better than like what I've been doing. Meaning, like, it's very educated. There's a lot of depth, and people with tons of experience and history and teachings. But it's a similar idea of bringing about that change, empowering people to make the world a better place and to turn things around.
Hmm.
Um, and I love that people with similar ideas are rising up, like those lights,
Hmm.
those beacons, and that's starting to ripple through. And so, like, I see the future as kind of a hybrid of some people will be able to work with psychedelics and share those insights,
Hmm.
um, and help others in their journey.
Hmm.
But ultimately, you also use the word feeling. I think one of the things that psychedelics do is they help us, like, really feel that
Hmm.
love, feel that connection, feel where
Yeah,
we are, like, really deeply. And it's almost like a human right in my mind, like, to be able to feel that, to be able to feel that coming home.
absolutely.
um, but you can't mandate it on everybody. Everybody needs to
Hmm.
find their
No.
own way. Everybody needs to find their journey.
Yeah.
It's their own journey. And so
Hmm.
it's an interesting dynamic of how do we share insights, but then empower people to find their ways.
Right, of course, people have to find it for themselves. But I think just in general, and psychedelic work is, arguably a significant part of this going forward, is that the more people awaken to who they truly are, the more that will influence everything around them,
Yeah.
right? Because people are influenced by ideas. I mean, you just see it, you suddenly, I mean, just heard something on the radio yesterday about this music festival, Coachella, and for the first time in its history of that festival, it's been going on for quite a while. They've got two um, uh, musicians already very famous in their own country from India, and both of them have been incredibly successful. One of them, one of his songs or whatever, has had like 100 million views on YouTube, right? So like in no time, an idea can spread, and if
Yeah.
it's a good idea, and the more it's sort of like multiple level work in a sense. Like, so somebody like that takes ayahuasca a few times and learns some things from it, that can creep into their music either
Yeah.
directly or indirectly, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So that's the filtering down or filtering through potential there too, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that because you're touching on another thing. I was trying to put the pieces together on how do we make this happen. And there's always this discussion of legalization versus decriminalization. And, with legalization, a lot of time it's hyper controlled with the kind of the medical industry, and it has to be tied to mental health cases and so on. And then the decriminalization, there's an aspect where it's like, no, everybody can benefit from those medicine. And there's actually a really huge benefit for decriminalizing it and people crossing path with the medicine without them necessarily acknowledging, oh my God, I've got a mental health issue, because a lot of times people can't even recognize that in themselves. So if they actually cross path with the medicine, from in an entertainment, in a song, going to a Grateful Dead concerts and having some mushrooms, and they have that recognition, they have that epiphany. They might never have had it otherwise. And so I
Hmm.
feel that decriminalization is also another big part of the solution,
Hmm.
with proper,
Yeah.
guardrails and training and community support, which I think is challenging based on how communities are organized right now.
Yeah.
Uh, but I feel like it's going to take a while as well. And you call that in the book, or several people called that out in the book. Maybe it was Dwayne who called that out. It might be like 30 or 50 years. I remember seeing
Hmm.
that in there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that the message about that is like, let's be prepared for this being an extremely unusual, unsettled, transitional time.
Yeah.
Like, we have to kind of go beyond, I hope, the entertainment mentality, that the world is here to entertain us, that we can hop on a plane regardless of how much carbon we use just to spend a week lying on a beach in Puerto Vallarta anytime we want. I'm sorry, but that's not necessarily what needs to happen now. And in fact, I suspect there will come a time, I don't know when exactly, where that kind of travel will be restricted. I mean, it's just one of many, many examples. There's
Yeah.
a wonderful book that's getting a lot of attention these days called "The Ministry for the Future." Um, and it takes place about 30 years in the future. And the Ministry for the Future is a United Nations organization which is charged with a lot of responsibility and funds to legislate things like that. And so at that time, around 2050, recreational air travel with a fossil fuel plane has been banned worldwide, basically. You could travel from New York to Paris in an airship, which will take you 2 to 3 days. I don't know if he said how that would be fueled, but obviously would have to be much more environmentally, neutral than
Yeah.
traveling in a jet plane. That kind of thing. We're going to see an incredible amount of innovation. We'll have to. It's survival. It's
Yeah.
getting to be survival. So that's what I'm saying is that I think what we're going to see, and hopefully people will relax, breathe, and ride with this, that we're moving out of the sort of the plastic age, if you will, the thin as paper, superficial entertainment kind of age, into an age of starting to take life more seriously, like connect with the real things more seriously, in a sense. Even music. I have a chapter later in the book called something like inspirational quotes or bringing it home or something like that. And I think the subtitle was more inspirational quotes. And one of them was Edgar Casey, who was this famous, he's known as the sleeping prophet. And from way back in the early 20th century, I think he successfully diagnosed all kinds of illnesses that nobody could by going into a trance state, in a sort of a sleep-like state or something like that.
Oh.
Anyway, I put a quote in by him that says, um, music and sound will be the medicine of the future.
Mm.
So just like our relationship to music is actually sort of like a perfect example of the change that hopefully we're going to be going through, and hopefully are already going through, is that music is used so cheaply and oftentimes listened to so casually and in semi inattentively, in the background while you talk or whatever, as if it's just part of the wallpaper, atmosphere setting. And that's fine too. My wife and I put on a jazz, dinner jazz kind of station while we
Yeah.
eat dinner sometimes. That's fine. But I think what we're likely to see, and what we need, is to start increasingly relating to music for the power that it has.
Yeah.
The power of musical vibration, in partly in the words, but in the force of music itself, and the beauty of music itself as a medicine,
Hmm.
and sound, in the sound, in the sense of, like, crystal bowls or something,
Yeah.
that are
Yeah.
not, you maybe wouldn't necessarily call it music in the sense of it's not creating a song or something, but it's generating a vibration, which in itself I think can be influential, it can be healing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. It's very healing, and it touches the vibration, every cells in our body.
Hmm.
Um, And you can definitely experience that with psychedelics. I mean, when you experience music and psychedelics together, like it's like I never heard music before. I was like,
Hey, cannabis does that too,
yes, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then creating music at this, yeah. There's a lot, and we go back to where you started. Creating music with you taking a few hits of totes, use that term, of cannabis. But that's also another wonderful experience. There's a self-healing aspect. You can
Yeah,
create that with music.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Stephen, we're pretty much at time. This has been a wonderful conversation. Where can people find your book, and when is the next convention you're organizing?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for the question. So the book's everywhere. It's on all the major online outlets, Barnes and Noble and Amazon and all those, and most bookstores, if they don't carry it in stock, will at least be able to get it pretty quickly because the publisher Inner Traditions, Park Street Press, is well established in the field. They have a good distribution network and so on and so on. So it wouldn't be hard to get the book at all. You could even go to my website if you want to. Here's a quick way of doing it. Go to my website, it's stephengrayvision.com. So that's StephenGray vision.com. And right there, I think it's on the homepage, it says, order book or something. And if you click on that, it gives you links to 4 or 5 of these places and just sends you there. I don't actually sell it from the website. So I still just get my crummy little $1 a book royalty. So I don't care about that. But it does point people quickly to where they can get it. And the conference, the website for the conference is spiritplantmedicine.com, in that order. Sometimes people have a hard time remembering whether they're plant spirit medicine or, anyway, it's spiritplantmedicine.com. SPMC is the sort of acronym for the conference, Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. And we actually are now selling super early bird tickets for that. It's in November 3rd to 5th in Vancouver at the University of British Columbia. There's something, if it's not unique, it's close to unique or rare in the psychedelic conference world that many people have acknowledged over our 12 past years, which is we deliberately have everybody in the same room. So the 500 people or so or more in this one room. So we're actually going through a journey together. We even have a cannabis ceremony on the Saturday evening, where we do it like what I was talking about much earlier in our conversation: silent meditation, sound journeying, guided meditations. Send people to go stand outside the building for a couple of minutes, have a couple of puffs, come back in silence, and do that for about an hour and a half. And that helps build the energy for the Sunday because people come back further opened already from that experience. Tickets are already, like, I think they're half off, 50% off of the full price right now for the next couple of months or so if people want to come. And the website shows you, I think we have about 2/3 to 3/4 of our speakers up on the website right now. Got some remarkable people as always, and always been really important, as is with the book, to hear from Indigenous people, earth connected people. We have a good contingent of those kind of voices at the conference as well.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested, and I saw the speaker lineup, and it looks great. And I encourage everybody to check out your book. I'm really enjoying it. I've looked and read a lot of psychedelic books, and this one is definitely on top. Though I haven't finished it yet, but I don't think I'm going to change my mind. Thank you, Stephen, for the time together, and I wish you a great rest of the day.
Well, thank you, Sebastian, and thanks for the interesting questions and provoking commentary that provoked further ideas. So I enjoyed having this conversation with you as well.
Thanks for listening. If you like the show, please subscribe to it on Apple Podcasts, follow me on Instagram at Leadershipedelics, or stop by my website and say hi at fooyad.com. That's F-O-O-Y-A-D. There's a lot going on, and I'd love to hear from you all, the listeners that tune in every week. And if you have suggestions for future guests, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm there, and I'd love to get more guests on the show. Thank you. Have a great day.